Listen, you think he's not interested. You are reading the signals completely wrong. You think distance means disinterest. You think silence means he has already moved on. But what if I told you that he thinks about you far more than you can imagine? And here comes the part that will sound almost unbelievable. The colder he behaves, the more intensely you may be occupying his mind. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear may change the way you interpret every silent moment, every delayed message, and every confusing interaction you've had with him. Most women walk away at the exact moment a man's thoughts start circling around them the most. They assume the quiet means rejection. They assume the pause means the story is over. But in many cases, that silence is not emptiness. It is pressure building inside him. It is conflict. It is emotion trying to find a safe place to exist without exposing him too quickly. What almost no one tells you is that when a man feels something deeply, his instinct is not always to come closer. Sometimes his instinct is to create space. Not because you don't matter, but because you matter more than he expected. Attraction, especially the kind that touches something deeper, makes a man feel exposed. It threatens his sense of control. It opens doors he may not be ready to walk through. So instead of moving toward you, he retreats into himself. And this is the moment where most misunderstandings are born. You see the distance and interpret it as lack of interest. He feels the intensity and interprets it as risk. Both of you react to the same situation, but from completely different emotional realities. Inside his mind, a quiet storm is forming. He replays conversations. He remembers small details you've already forgotten. He wonders how you would react in certain situations. He imagines what being closer to you would actually feel like. But instead of expressing those thoughts, he keeps them contained. He behaves calmly, maybe even coldly, because to him, showing too much too soon feels like giving up power. There is a psychological tension that arises when a man is attracted but uncertain. Part of him wants to move closer, to explore, to feel more. Another part of him warns him to slow down, to protect himself, to avoid emotional chaos. And when those two forces collide, his behavior begins to look confusing from the outside. He might approach, then withdraw. He might start a conversation, then disappear. Now, he might watch you closely without ever stepping forward. What looks like inconsistency is often just internal conflict. And here's the painful truth. Many women misinterpret that conflict as indifference. They assume he's playing games, or that he's emotionally unavailable, or that he simply doesn't care enough. So they pull away, or they push for clarity, or they demand certainty. And the moment they do that, the fragile emotional space he was quietly exploring collapses. Because men rarely process attraction through constant conversation. They process it internally, in silence, in observation, in reflection. If you interrupt that process with pressure, even well-intentioned pressure, it can feel like emotional noise to him. And when emotional noise appears, his instinct is to step back even further. But if you know what to look for, there are certain patterns that reveal the truth. There are subtle signs that show you are living in his mind, even if he never says it out loud. These signs don't come from grand gestures or romantic declarations. They appear in small, almost invisible moments. And once you notice them, you can't unsee them. The first sign is something most women overlook completely because they're watching the wrong things. They pay attention to how he behaves directly toward them, but ignore how he behaves around them. When a man is thinking about you more than he admits, He observes you in quiet ways. He studies how you talk, how you react, how you move through a room. You might catch him looking at you for a second too long, then quickly looking away, as if nothing happened. That quick shift of his gaze is not boredom. It's awareness. It's restraint. It's the moment he realizes he's paying too much attention. Men who feel nothing don't observe. They don't notice patterns. They don't remember how you laugh, or the way your voice changes when you're excited. Indifference is simple. It is quiet, clean, and empty. But interest, especially hidden interest, is full of small signals. In digital spaces, this becomes even more subtle. He may watch your stories consistently, but never comment. He may be one of the first to see what you post, yet remain silent. He notices changes, new photos, new moods, new energy. But he doesn't step forward, not because he doesn't care, but because engagement would reveal how much attention he's already giving you. And attention is a doorway. Once a man opens that door, he risks becoming emotionally invested. So he stands at the threshold, watching, thinking, but not crossing. The second sign is even more revealing. He remembers small details you barely noticed yourself. You might mention something in passing, a stressful day, a childhood memory, a food you like, a place you avoid. Weeks later, he brings it up casually, as if it were nothing. You may think he's just being polite, or that it's a coincidence. But men rarely store emotional details unless they carry weight. His mind chooses what feels important. And if he remembers something you didn't emphasize, it means he replayed that conversation in his head. He thought about it when you weren't there. He gave it space in his mind. That is not casual attention. That is mental presence. Sometimes he won't even realize why he remembers. He just does. Because attraction often begins beneath conscious thought. His mind marks certain moments as significant long before he understands why. And then there is a third sign, one that doesn't come directly from him, but from the environment around him. Other people start noticing something before you do. His friends behave differently when you're around. They exchange looks. They smile in a way that suggests they know something you don't. They might casually mention your name, as if you're already part of an ongoing story. Men don't always speak openly about attraction, but they hint at it. They drop names. They ask quiet questions. And if his friends recognize you without spending much time with you, it means your name has come up more than once. Enough to leave an impression. You are not just another person to him. You are a subject, a thought, a possibility. And this is where the confusion usually begins, because the next sign seems completely contradictory on the surface. It's the behavior that drives many women crazy. He reaches out unexpectedly and then disappears again. One day he sends a random message, a simple question, a comment, something small that reminds him of you. There is no big explanation, no dramatic confession, just enough contact to break the silence. The conversation flows. The energy feels natural, familiar, alive. And just when you think something is finally building, he retreats again. Days pass. The silence returns. You start wondering what you did wrong. But here's the truth. Most people never consider. He didn't disappear because the conversation was bad. He disappeared because it affected him more than he expected. Reaching out gave him emotional relief. Pulling back gave him a sense of control. This is the push and pull happening inside his mind. One part of him wants connection. Another part fears losing his emotional balance. So he moves forward, then steps back. Not to play games, but to regulate what he feels. And the very existence of that cycle is proof of something important. Indifference doesn't create patterns. Only emotional investment does. If you meant nothing to him, there would be no tension, no sudden messages, no inner conflict. There would simply be silence. And it would stay that way. And once you begin to see this pattern, everything starts to make more sense. What once looked like inconsistency begins to reveal itself as emotional hesitation. What once felt like rejection begins to look more like internal struggle. And there are still deeper signs beneath the surface, signals hidden not in what he says, but in how his energy shifts when you're around. And this is where things become even more revealing, because the next signs are not found in his words, but in the subtle shifts of his behavior. They live in the small differences most people overlook, the almost invisible changes in tone, posture, and energy that only appear when someone truly affects him. Watch how he is with other people, with friends, with strangers, with women he doesn't care about. He is relaxed, predictable, almost automatic. His laughter comes easily. His posture is open. His words flow without effort. There is no tension in him, no hesitation, no internal calculation. He is simply himself, untouched, unchallenged, emotionally neutral. But then observe him when he is around you. Something changes. Maybe he becomes quieter. Maybe he becomes more careful with his words. Perhaps he jokes less, or suddenly, more than usual. Maybe his tone softens. Maybe he holds eye contact for just a moment too long before looking away. Or maybe he avoids your gaze altogether, as if eye contact might reveal more than he wants to show. These are not random behaviors. They are signals from the nervous system. When a man feels nothing, his body remains calm and neutral. But when someone begins to matter, his internal state shifts. He becomes more alert, more aware of himself, more careful with how he appears. And here's what most women misunderstand. Controlled behavior is not a lack of attraction. Often, it is the presence of it. Men don't regulate themselves around people who mean nothing to them. They don't worry about saying the wrong thing or giving the wrong impression to someone who is emotionally irrelevant. Caution only appears when something feels important. If he seems more composed, more deliberate, more restrained around you, it may be because he doesn't want to ruin what he feels. He is monitoring himself. And people only monitor themselves when there is something at stake. The next sign is even more subtle because it doesn't look like interest at all. In fact, many women interpret it as insecurity or inconsistency. But in reality, it often reveals the opposite. He tests you, but not in obvious ways. He might casually mention another woman, not to make you jealous directly, but to observe your reaction. He might delay plans or change his energy slightly, just to see how you handle uncertainty. He might pull back for a while, not because he has lost interest, but because he wants to see if you chase him. And most women don't even realize they are being observed in these moments. They think he is confused. They think he is emotionally unavailable. They think he is playing games. But often, he is simply asking silent questions. Does she stay calm when things are unclear? Does she lose her center easily? Does she react with pressure? Does she respect herself? Does being close to her feel peaceful or exhausting? Men who feel something real do not rush blindly into emotional chaos. They become cautious. They want to know if closeness will feel safe or if it will drain them. So instead of asking these questions directly, they observe. They test the emotional climate. And here is the key detail. If he didn't care, he wouldn't test anything. He would either pursue casually, without depth, or disappear completely. Testing only happens when there is both attraction and uncertainty at the same time. But this is where many women unknowingly sabotage the connection. They overreact. They seek constant reassurance. They try to explain themselves. They try to secure the bond before it has naturally formed. And emotional pressure does not create closeness for most men. It creates retreat. The woman who passes these unspoken tests is not cold, distant, or indifferent. She is centered. She does not collapse under ambiguity. She does not chase clarity at every silent moment. She allows space to exist without filling it with fear. And that brings us to one of the most difficult signs to understand, but also one of the most powerful. He remains present without claiming you. He doesn't disappear completely. He doesn't close the door. He doesn't move on in a clean, final way. Even when he is distant, he keeps a subtle thread between you. A reaction here, a message there, a quiet acknowledgement of your presence. It's never enough to feel like commitment, but it's also never empty enough to feel like closure. And many women interpret this as hesitation or lack of seriousness. But psychologically, it is something else entirely. It is containment. He keeps the connection alive because letting it die would feel like a loss. But fully stepping in would require emotional exposure, and he may not be ready for that yet. So he stays at the edge, not because he is playing games, but because he is negotiating something inside himself. And this is where your behavior becomes more important than anything he says or does. You cannot force him forward. You cannot talk him into certainty. You cannot analyze the connection into existence. The moment you try to control the outcome, the dynamic shifts from attraction into management. And men rarely fall in love in spaces where they feel managed. What actually draws him closer is something much quieter. Your stability, your warmth without pressure, your presence without demands, your ability to stay open without trying to pull him toward a decision. Men move toward emotional environments that feel calm and secure. And paradoxically, the woman who doesn't need immediate answers often becomes the woman he cannot stop thinking about, because unresolved tension doesn't disappear. It deepens. And here is a truth most people never say out loud. The man who withdraws when he feels something is not always weak or confused. Sometimes he is simply aware that his emotions carry weight, and weight requires respect. If you can sit in uncertainty without losing yourself, without trying to drag him closer or push him away, you become a reference point in his mind. Not because you chased him, not because you convinced him, but because you didn't crumble under silence. And that kind of emotional strength stays with a man far longer than any clever message or romantic gesture. You don't have to act immediately. You don't have to decide everything right now. Clarity does not grow in pressure. It grows in space. And while you are wondering where you stand, something else is happening quietly inside him. Because a man does not move from interest to action the moment he feels something. He moves when his internal resistance finally softens. When the noise in his head quiets down enough for desire to turn into decision. And that process is silent. While you're checking your phone, replaying conversations, and searching for signs, his mind is negotiating with itself. He is weighing risks, measuring emotional cost, asking questions he will never say out loud. What if I lose control? What if I start to care more than I expected? What if she changes my life in ways I'm not ready for? Men do not fear connection as much as they fear transformation. Because real attraction doesn't just add someone to his life, it changes him. It forces him to face parts of himself he has kept hidden or contained. That is why many men slow down when feelings become real. Not because they don't care, but because they care enough to take it seriously. And this is where many women unintentionally block the very thing they want. They interpret his pause as a lack of interest. They react to silence with pressure. They try to clarify what hasn't even settled inside him yet. But clarity at this stage does not come from conversations. It comes from contrast. And the contrast that quietly moves a man from internal obsession to external action is something very simple and very rare. Absence without withdrawal. Absence without withdrawal. That is the space where his feelings begin to speak louder than his fears. This does not mean disappearing, ignoring him, or playing cold games. It does not mean punishing his silence or trying to make him jealous. It means something far more powerful and far more difficult. You remain present in your own life. You stay warm when you interact. You don't shrink, but you also don't lean forward in desperation. You stop chasing outcomes, and instead, you start protecting your inner balance. And something very quiet begins to happen inside his mind. The emotional space you are no longer filling with pressure starts to echo. He notices your absence in a way he never noticed your presence. Not because you vanished, but because you stopped trying to control the connection. The emotional pull you once created through effort is no longer there. And now, he feels the difference. He starts to realize that the connection does not move unless he moves. That the energy between you is not something he can passively receive. And that realization creates a shift inside him. Because obsession is not built on availability. It is built on contrast, on the difference between what he feels when you are emotionally close, and what he feels when that closeness is no longer being offered so freely. You become the woman who didn't try to pull him forward, the one who didn't demand clarity, the one who trusted herself enough to let him arrive at his own conclusions. And men move decisively when the decision feels like it belongs to them. The moment he realizes that he is thinking about you without being pushed, without being chased, without being reminded, something inside him clicks. It's no longer about your actions. It becomes about his own feelings, his own desire, his own internal pull. That is when behavior begins to change. Not dramatically at first, not with grand declarations or emotional speeches, but with consistency. He starts initiating more intentionally. He closes emotional gaps instead of creating them. He becomes more direct, not because you asked, but because the uncertainty inside him becomes uncomfortable. What once felt safe, distance, silence, emotional control, now starts to feel like loss. And loss is the one thing most men act quickly to avoid. But this transformation only happens under one condition. You don't contaminate the process with fear. You don't force conversations he hasn't finished internally. You don't react emotionally to every withdrawal. You don't try to secure something that hasn't fully formed yet. Because the moment you do, you give him a reason to retreat. Pressure gives him justification to step back. Stability removes his excuses. And here is the hardest truth to accept. If a man never moves forward, it is not because you waited too long. It is because he never reached the point where losing you felt real. And that is not something you create by pushing. It is something you allow by not chasing. You don't have to perform. You don't have to manipulate. You don't have to become cold or distant. You simply remain whole, centered, and unavailable for emotional chaos. That is what men respond to when attraction becomes serious. Because a man does not commit himself simply because he feels wanted. Yeah, he commits when he feels anchored, and anchors do not chase drifting ships. They stay grounded. If you begin to recognize these signs, don't rush to reinterpret every moment from the past. Don't replay every conversation with panic or hope. Just observe. Watch how he behaves when you stop trying to manage the outcome. Watch how his energy shifts when you stop reacting to every silence. Watch what happens when your presence carries no pressure, because the man who is truly affected will always return to the woman who did not try to pull him closer, but allowed him to feel the distance himself. And this leads to a moment almost no one talks about. The moment just before a man makes an emotional commitment. Not publicly, not verbally, internally. This is the danger zone. Not because things are falling apart, but because they are about to come together. And many women unknowingly destroy the connection right here. Up to this point, his attraction has been largely internal, private, contained. He has been thinking, weighing, observing how you influence him, observing how he reacts to your presence and your absence. But then something shifts. Thinking becomes uncomfortable, not painful, but restless. Because attraction, when it deepens, stops being a pleasant distraction. It becomes a demand for resolution. His mind does not want to carry emotional tension forever. His nervous system wants relief. And for a man, relief usually comes in only two forms: action or detachment. Everything depends on this moment. If the emotional environment feels calm, safe, and non-invasive, he moves forward. If it feels heavy, pressured, étoilé, or emotionally charged, he pulls away. And this is where many women misunderstand the situation completely. They see his hesitation and think he needs reassurance. They feel the silence and think they must clarify things. They sense the distance and try to pull him closer. But from his perspective, these actions don't feel like connection. They feel like pressure. There is something critical you must understand. Men rarely process attraction by talking about it. They process it by sitting with it. Silence is not avoidance for him. It is digestion. He needs space to feel what he feels without interruption. And if that space is constantly filled with emotional questions, subtle demands, or pressure for clarity, the process short circuits. He begins to feel like his inner world is being invaded before he has organized it. And men are extremely protective of unfinished internal processes. That is why timing matters more than intention. You could say the right thing at the wrong moment, and it could change how safe he feels around you. Not because your words were wrong, but because his emotional system was not ready to receive them. When a man is deeply affected, he becomes more sensitive to emotional imbalance. He begins to scan for signs that getting closer will cost him his peace. He watches how you handle uncertainty. He observes how you respond to silence. He senses whether you become reactive or remain stable, not always consciously, but instinctively. And that is why women who appear calm and low pressure at this stage often receive more investment. Not because they care less, but because they don't bring fear into the emotional space. Fear is loud, even when unspoken, even when disguised as concern or communication. His nervous system feels it. And the moment closeness starts to feel like emotional turbulence, attraction begins to collapse into avoidance. Not because he stopped liking you, but because his body learned that being close to you might cost him his inner balance. And this is the part most people struggle to accept. Attraction rarely dies from lack of interest. It dies from emotional overload. Overload doesn't always come from drama. Sometimes it comes from subtle pressure, repeated check-ins, small questions, shifts in tone when he doesn't respond quickly, expectations that were never agreed upon. All of this registers as demand, but there is something that pulls him forward far more powerfully than any demand ever could. Silence. Not cold silence. Not punishment. Just calm, open space. And in that space, something inside him begins to grow louder than his fears. And in that quiet space, something inside him begins to rise to the surface. Something he can no longer ignore, no longer silence, no longer rationalize away. Because when there is no pressure, no emotional noise, no constant demand for answers, the only thing left for him to face is his own desire. He can't blame your questions. He can't blame your expectations. He can't blame the situation. All that remains is the simple, uncomfortable truth. He misses you. He thinks about you. And the absence of pressure makes that realization even sharper. When you stop trying to control the direction of the connection, the tension doesn't disappear. It actually deepens. But now, it has nowhere to escape. He cannot justify distance by telling himself it's too complicated or too intense. He cannot say he feels pushed. He cannot tell himself that the timing is wrong because nothing is demanding action from him. And when desire is left alone without obstacles, it grows. This is the moment where the shift begins. Not because you did something new, but because you stopped interfering with what was already forming inside him. His behavior slowly starts to change. At first it may be almost invisible. He reaches out with more intention. He follows through instead of disappearing. He starts conversations without needing an excuse. He shows up more consistently. There is less hot and cold, less emotional oscillation, more direction. And this change doesn't come from pressure. It comes from clarity. His inner chaos begins to settle, and what remains is simple: attraction, respect, curiosity, and the quiet awareness that losing you would not feel neutral, lest it would feel like a mistake. But here is where many women become afraid, and fear makes them react in ways that reverse the entire process. Because letting go of control feels dangerous. It feels like standing on the edge of uncertainty without a safety net. Questions start to appear in the mind. What if he never comes forward? What if I misunderstood everything? What if the silence just keeps stretching on? And those questions create tension. Tension changes energy. Energy changes behavior. Suddenly, conversations feel heavier. Moments feel loaded with expectation. Silence feels uncomfortable instead of peaceful. He may not be able to explain it, but something starts to feel off to him. He no longer feels invited into a calm emotional space. He feels observed, measured, monitored. And men rarely move toward environments where they feel watched. They move toward spaces where they feel accepted without performance. That is why the woman who stops grasping often becomes the one he returns to, not because she gave up, but because she stopped trying to force outcomes. Grasping suffocates attraction. Presence without pressure gives it room to breathe. Your real power does not lie in convincing him to choose you. It lies in making your presence emotionally clean. No urgency, no emotional debt, no hidden demands, just warmth, calm, and authenticity. And this does not mean suppressing your feelings. It does not mean pretending you don't care. It means you take responsibility for your own emotional state instead of outsourcing it to him. You feel what you feel, but you don't expect him to regulate it for you. That distinction changes everything. A man will lean into emotion when it feels inviting, not when it feels like a challenge he must solve. He moves toward what feels peaceful inside, not toward what feels heavy or complicated. And here is something important to understand. If a man is truly affected by you, he will come back, unless the path becomes blocked by pressure, drama, or emotional chaos. He may hesitate. He may need time. He may circle around the decision more than you would like. But attraction that has settled into his inner world does not disappear quietly. It either matures or it collapses under pressure. There is no middle ground. The woman who understands this stops trying to manage his feelings. Instead, she protects the emotional climate around her. She doesn't chase. She doesn't manipulate. She doesn't withdraw in bitterness. She stays grounded in herself. And grounded women become reference points in a man's mind. They become the quiet standard by which he measures other connections. The woman whose absence feels different. The woman whose presence feels like peace. Not because she did more, but because she disturbed less. And this is where the real turning point happens, the one most women never consciously experience. Because when you stop managing his feelings, he finally begins to feel his own, not diluted by your fear, not distorted by your pressure, not rushed by your need for answers, just pure emotion, rising naturally inside him. Men often need space for their feelings to take shape, and that space only appears when you stop trying to control the direction of the connection. In that silence, he begins to realize what losing you would actually mean. He senses that you are not trying to hold on to him. And strangely, that is what makes him want to hold on to you. Not because he has to, but because he chooses to. Silence becomes an echo. And in that echo, your presence lingers. Not as pressure, not as expectation, but as a feeling he cannot easily replace. And this is where the mystery starts to dissolve. Because when a man truly decides, he does not act out of fear, urgency, or confusion. He acts out of clarity. The inner conflict fades. The emotional noise settles. And what remains is simple and honest. He wants you in his life. Not as an option, not as a possibility, but as a decision. And when a man reaches that point, his actions stop being inconsistent. He doesn't come halfway. He doesn't test the waters endlessly, nor he steps forward with direction. But before that moment arrives, there is one final truth you need to understand. Because many women unknowingly destroy the connection right before it becomes real. It happens in a very quiet way, not through arguments or dramatic scenes, but through something much more subtle. Interpretation spirals. Interpretation spirals. This is the silent force that ruins more connections than rejection ever could. It begins in a very small way. A delayed message, a shorter reply, a shift in tone you can't quite explain. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, just a tiny change in the rhythm between you. But the mind doesn't like uncertainty, so it starts searching for meaning. Why did he take so long to answer? Did I say something wrong? Is he losing interest? Is there someone else? One question leads to another. And before you realize it, you are no longer experiencing the connection as it is. You are experiencing your interpretation of it. You stop being present in the moment and you start living inside expectations, fears, and imagined outcomes. And expectation always carries pressure. You may not say anything directly, but you may still sound calm on the surface. But energy changes long before words do. Your tone shifts slightly. Your patience becomes thinner. Your warmth becomes conditional. Silence starts to feel heavy instead of peaceful. He senses it, even if he can't explain it. The conversations start to feel more serious than they used to. Moments that once felt light now carry invisible weight. He begins to feel like he is being evaluated, like every delay, Every word, every decision is being measured. And men rarely move toward spaces where they feel monitored. They move toward spaces where they feel accepted without performance. That is why the woman who lets go of constant interpretation often becomes the one he returns to. Not because she stopped caring, but because she stopped gripping the situation with fear. Grasping suffocates attraction. Calm presence allows it to breathe. There is a powerful shift that happens when you stop trying to decode every small detail. Your energy becomes lighter. Your presence becomes easier to be around. You're no longer bringing tension into every interaction. And tension, even silent tension, is exhausting for a man. Your real influence does not come from trying to make him choose you. It comes from making your presence emotionally clean. No hidden urgency, no emotional debt, no silent expectations waiting to be fulfilled. Just warmth, steadiness, and authenticity. And that does not mean you suppress your feelings. It does not mean you pretend everything is fine when it's not. It simply means you take responsibility for your emotional world instead of placing that responsibility on his shoulders. You feel what you feel, but you don't demand that he fix it. This distinction is subtle, but it changes everything. Because a man will lean into emotion when it feels safe, not when it feels like a problem he has to solve. And here is something most people never say openly. If a man is truly affected by you, he will come back, unless the path becomes blocked by pressure, drama, or emotional chaos. He may take time. He may hesitate. He may move slower than you want. But interest that has settled into his inner world does not simply vanish. It either grows or it gets crushed. There is no quiet third option. And the woman who understands this stops trying to control his reactions. She stops trying to manage the outcome. Instead, she protects the emotional atmosphere around her. She doesn't chase. She doesn't manipulate. She doesn't punish silence. She simply stays grounded. And grounded women leave a deeper imprint than those who try to impress or persuade. They become emotional reference points in a man's mind. The woman he compares others to. The one whose absence feels different. The one whose energy feels like calm instead of conflict. Not because she did more, but because she disturbed less. And this is where the real turning point occurs. The one most women never consciously recognize. Because when you stop managing his emotions, he begins to feel his own more clearly than ever. Not diluted by your fear. Not distorted by your expectations. Not rushed by your need for certainty. Just pure, unfiltered feeling. Men often need space for their emotions to form. And that space only exists when you stop trying to control the direction of the connection. In that quiet, he begins to sense what your absence would actually mean. He notices that you are not clinging to him. He realizes you are not trying to secure him. He feels that you are whole without him. And strangely, that is what makes him want you more. Not because you are unavailable, but because you are emotionally self-sufficient. When silence becomes an echo, and that echo carries your presence, something inside him settles. The confusion fades. The hesitation softens. And what remains is clarity. He doesn't move out of fear. He doesn't move out of pressure. He moves because he wants to. And when a man reaches that point, his behavior changes in ways that are impossible to fake. He becomes more intentional, more consistent, more present. Not because you demanded it, but because he chose it. But before everything comes together, there is one final realization you need to hear. Because this is the truth that ties everything you've heard into one clear understanding. Because this is the truth that ties everything together. A man who feels nothing creates silence that is empty. There are no signals, no cycles, no subtle threads connecting you. He disappears, and the space he leaves behind feels final, clean, uncomplicated. There's no tension, no confusion, no emotional pull, just absence. But a man who is affected by you creates a different kind of silence. It is not empty. It is charged. It is filled with pauses, returns, small gestures, unfinished conversations, and moments that feel like they almost meant something. That kind of silence is not the end of a story. It is the middle of one. And the difference between those two silences is everything. Many women spend their energy trying to force clarity, trying to decode every behavior, trying to push the connection toward a decision. But clarity rarely grows under pressure. It grows in space, in time, in emotional environments that feel safe enough for truth to surface on its own. You cannot rush a man into genuine desire. You cannot argue him into emotional certainty. And you cannot talk him into feelings he has not fully formed inside himself. All you can do is influence the atmosphere in which those feelings either grow or collapse. If your presence feels like pressure, he will move away. If your presence feels like peace, he will move closer. It really is that simple, even if it doesn't always feel that way. The woman who changes everything for a man is rarely the one who spoke the most, chased the hardest, or tried to prove her worth. She is the one who felt different to be around, the one whose presence didn't demand performance, not the one who didn't turn every silence into a problem. She didn't ignore her feelings. She didn't pretend not to care. But she also didn't let fear control her behavior. She stayed steady. She stayed warm. She stayed whole. And because of that, her energy lingered in his mind long after the conversations ended. He compared other interactions to the way he felt around her. He noticed that something was missing elsewhere. Not excitement, not drama, not intensity, but calm. And calm is rare. When a man finds someone whose presence feels like emotional quiet instead of emotional noise, he remembers it. He carries it with him. And if he is truly affected, he eventually moves toward it again. Not because he is chaste, not because he is convinced, but because he wants to return to that feeling. This is why the woman who remains centered often becomes unforgettable. She becomes the emotional reference point, the silent standard, the one he thinks about when the world around him feels too loud, too complicated, too demanding. Her power was never in controlling him. It was in not losing herself. And when a man finally reaches clarity, he does not move halfway. He does not linger in confusion. He does not keep circling the same emotional distance. He steps forward with direction, not out of urgency, not out of fear, but out of certainty. Because by that point, the inner conflict has settled. The emotional noise has quieted. And what remains is simple: attraction, respect, and the quiet knowledge that losing you would feel like a real loss. And when that realization arrives, everything becomes clearer. His actions grow more consistent. His presence becomes more stable. His interest becomes visible instead of hidden. Not because you forced it into the light, but because it matured naturally. So if you find yourself in a situation where his silence confuses you, don't rush to conclusions. Don't immediately assume the worst. Instead, look deeper. Observe the patterns. Notice the small signs. Pay attention to the emotional climate between you. Because sometimes the man who seems distant on the surface is the one thinking about you the most beneath it. And sometimes the greatest influence you have is not in what you say or do, but in the emotional space you allow to exist between you. If this made you see his behavior in a new light, take a quiet moment and reflect on the interactions you once misunderstood. Not with panic, not with false hope, just with calm awareness. Because the moment you stop trying to control the outcome is often the moment the truth finally begins to move toward you.